just a pipe, a toy. That was the way German officers described it. A length of steel tube slung over the shoulders of American infantrymen, nothing more than plumbing pipe in their eyes. They laughed when they first saw it, joked that their mighty Panzers would roll over such foolish contraptions without slowing down. To them, the bazooka was a child's plaything, not a weapon of war. They didn't know that the very pipe they mocked would soon rip open their armor in the hills of Italy. The story of the bazooka begins far from the battlefield, in American workshops in the early 1940s. Two men, Colonel Leslie Skinner and a young officer named Edward Ohl, had been experimenting with ways to give the average infantryman a weapon capable of piercing tank armor. Until then, the rifleman faced the impossible. Against a German Panzer, even the strongest man armed with grenades or rifles could do nothing but dive for cover. Sherman tanks rolled alongside the GIs, but even they often found themselves outgunned by the long-barreled Panzer Roman IV or the feared Tiger. The foot soldier needed a weapon that was light, portable, and deadly. Skinner and Ohl had an idea, a small rocket that could be fired from the shoulder. The launcher itself was little more than a tube, smooth, ungainly, and strange to look at. It earned its name in an unusual way. In those years, an American radio comedian, Bob Burns, played a whimsical instrument he called the bazooka, a crude brass contraption that made comical, flatulent notes. Soldiers, seeing this new rocket launcher that looked equally odd and tubular, borrowed the name. They laughed when they said it. "Hand me that bazooka." The word stuck, and soon the name traveled across camps and platoons, all the way to the front lines. When the M1 Bazooka was first introduced in North Africa in late 1942, even American soldiers weren't sure what to make of it. Some called it a stovepipe with delusions of grandeur. Others rolled their eyes at the idea that something so simple could defeat armor. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't intimidating like the heavy machine guns or the thunderous artillery. It was a tube, a shoulder rest, a battery-powered trigger, and a rocket. That was it. Yet inside that crude tube lay a warhead filled with a shaped charge designed to melt through steel with a focused blast of heat and pressure. The soldiers trained with it in the dust of desert camps. They learned quickly that it was no toy. The electric firing switch was powered by nothing more than a small flashlight battery. A squeeze of the grip sent current racing to the rocket motor, and in an instant, a screaming trail of fire and smoke burst from the rear. The backblast could sear the skin or set a man's uniform smoldering if he stood too close. Recruits coughed through the choking exhaust and felt their hearts pound as the rocket shrieked away. Sometimes it misfired, leaving a live round stuck inside the tube, and the unlucky gunner would sweat bullets as his loader nervously tapped it free. For the green soldier, the bazooka was terrifying. For the veteran, it became a promise here, finally, was a way to fight back. It was a two-man weapon. One soldier carried the launcher, the other carried rockets in a canvas bag slung across his shoulder. The loader shoved the round into the open breech, called out, "Ready!" and the gunner shouldered the tube, sighting through simple iron bars. With a crackle and roar, the rocket flew, trailing smoke, hissing toward its target. If it hit steel at the right angle, the shaped charge carved a hole like a molten spear through armor that had once been thought invincible. But in those early days, the Germans dismissed the idea entirely. Reports trickled across the lines about American rocket guns, and officers smirked at them. Against the thick armor of their Panzers, they believed no small infantry weapon could stand a chance. They felt secure, confident that their armored columns were untouchable, that the battlefield still belonged to iron beasts. Their laughter echoed in war rooms and field briefings. Yet among American squads preparing for the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, the bazooka was beginning to spread. Platoon leaders requested them. Infantrymen who once had only rifles now carried rockets across their shoulders. They practiced in orchards and olive groves, learning how to fire from windows, from ditches, from behind stone walls. They discovered the weapon's quirks, the need to fire at close range, the way the smoke betrayed their position, the way the backblast forced them to relocate immediately. But still, they carried it with growing confidence. In hushed voices, soldiers began to say, "This stovepipe might just save us." They remembered the helplessness of facing a Panzer with nothing but grenades. They remembered watching Shermans burn. Now, at least, they had a fighting chance. As the invasion fleet set sail towards Sicily, German officers still laughed, calling it a toy, a gimmick. But American soldiers gripped the strange pipes tighter, rockets rattling in their canvas bags. Soon, in the hills and villages of Italy, the laughter would stop. The weapon the Germans mocked as a joke was about to prove itself in fire and steel. German officers gathered their tank crews in shaded groves and stone barns before the march through Sicily. They spoke with authority, brimming with the confidence of past victories. "Amerikaner weapons are weak," they told their men. "Their so-called bazooka is nothing. It cannot pierce a Panzer's armor. Advance boldly. Infantry can do nothing to you." The words carried the weight of conviction. For years, German armor had thundered across Europe, shrugging off rifle fire, grenades, even most Allied anti-tank guns. Tank crews believed their officers. They felt untouchable, as if steel itself blessed them with invincibility. In truth, the Germans had their own rocket weapon, the Panzer. It was heavy, disposable, brutally effective at short range. Its warhead was bulkier, its penetration deeper than the early American designs. German soldiers compared the Panzer to the strange tube they had glimpsed in Allied hands and sneered. "Our Faust cracks tanks in half," they muttered. "Theirs is a toy, a child's plaything." That arrogance hardened into certainty as columns of Panzer III and IVs prepared to rumble down the narrow Sicilian roads, their treads clanking, their crews secure in the idea that no foot soldier could stop them. But the battlefield was changing. Dust hung heavy in the July heat as American GIs crouched in ambush along stone walls and ditches outside sun-baked villages. Their uniforms were streaked with sweat and grit. In their hands, or resting across their shoulders, lay the awkward tubes the Germans mocked. The bazookas looked unimpressive, but the soldiers carrying them felt the pulse of something new. They shifted nervously, loaders fumbling with the rockets in their canvas bags, the gunners whispering last checks, "Battery good," "Contact clip in." Somewhere up the road, engines growled, a sound that made every stomach tighten. The Panzer column appeared in clouds of dust. Steel silhouettes, broad-shouldered and menacing, advanced with casual menace. Commanders sat half-exposed from their hatches, scanning the hills with field glasses, certain they faced nothing but scattered riflemen. The lead tank's treads churned over loose gravel as children scattered from the roadside. Behind broken walls, two young Americans waited. One carried the tube on his shoulder, heart hammering. The other loaded a rocket, his hands trembling as he locked it in place. "Ready," the loader hissed. The gunner swallowed hard. The sight was crude, just bars of iron. He lined them on the tank side and squeezed the grip. A flash cracked, a roar thundered, and a screaming trail of smoke burst from the tube. The rocket streaked across the road like a fiery arrow. It slammed into the Panzer's flank. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the tank erupted in a gout of fire and steel. The crew clawed at hatches, choking in smoke, scrambling to escape as flames poured from the engine deck. German infantry froze. Officers who had smirked at the word bazooka stared in shock. Spielzug, neen tödlich, one muttered. Toy no deadly. The laughter that had filled their briefings died there on the dusty Sicilian road. The Americans had little time to celebrate. The backblast from the launch had painted their position in smoke and fire. Every German within sight turned their rifles and machine guns toward the wall where the bazooka team hid. Bullets chewed stone. The two soldiers rolled, sprinted, and scrambled to new cover as their comrades shouted and fired rifles to cover them. That was the cruel truth of the bazooka. It was powerful, but it made the firer a marked man. Every shot demanded an immediate retreat, a new ambush, a fresh gamble with survival. Again and again, GIs learned the rhythm. The rocket roared, the tank shuddered, and then came the furious storm of return fire. Sometimes the blast seared the paint from the launcher, leaving it scarred and blackened. Sometimes the rocket struck true into a track, tearing it free, leaving the tank crippled and grinding helplessly in circles. Other times it slammed into an engine deck, flames bursting from vents, crews scrambling out in panic. Even a glancing blow rattled crews, reminding them that the battlefield had changed. The infantry they once dismissed now carried death on their shoulders. Word of these ambushes traveled quickly. In villages where Panzers had once crushed resistance with ease, German commanders now found themselves losing tanks to what their men had called primitive rocket pipes. In Cassino's rubble-choked streets, in the orchards outside Palermo, in nameless farm lanes, American squads proved that the stovepipe was no joke. Soldiers began to whisper of GIs who single-handedly stopped columns, who knocked out tanks one after another until their rockets were gone and their tubes glowed hot. Reports crossed the lines, carried in urgent dispatches to Berlin. Intelligence officers, once dismissive, now underlined their warnings. American bazooka effective against armor at close range, danger to Panzer crews. They noted that tank formations, once free to roll where they pleased, now required infantry screens to protect them from ambush. German planners ordered changes. Panzers were never again to advance into tight villages without dismounted support. The arrogance had cracked, replaced by a grudging respect born of fire and smoke. Still, for the men inside those steel coffins, the fear was personal. Tank crews who had once felt invincible now jumped at every shadow near a wall, every flash in a window, every whisper of movement in an alley. They had learned the hard truth. A single American with a strange pipe could end their war in an instant. The war in Italy was fought not just in the hills and fields, but in the choking alleys of ancient towns, where stone walls turned every corner into a trap and every street into a battlefield. In Naples, in Cassino, in the ruins around Anzio, tanks that had once rolled with thunderous confidence now found themselves crawling cautiously through narrow streets, hemmed in by rubble and shadow. The Panzer Roman IV, the backbone of German armored might, growled forward between shattered buildings, its tracks grinding over cobblestones worn smooth by centuries. Its commander peered from the hatch, waving infantry ahead. Yet for all their caution, the enemy was already waiting. A basement window yawned open in the debris of a collapsed house. From the darkness emerged the outline of a thin young GI, his face streaked with sweat and dust. On his shoulder rested the awkward pipe the Germans had called a toy. His loader crouched at his side, clutching a canvas bag heavy with rockets, whispering a hurried prayer. The machine gun on the Panzer's hull rattled suddenly, stitching bullets into walls and scattering stone chips, but the gunner held steady. He sighted through crude iron bars, his breath shallow, then squeezed the grip. A roar split the air, filling the basement with smoke and sparks. The rocket screamed forward, trailing fire. It struck the Panzer at point-blank range. In an instant, the street erupted. Flames burst from the tank's side. The engine deck blew open in a shower of steel. German crewmen banged at hatches, their hands burning on hot steel, scrambling into the street as the vehicle belched black smoke. The Americans ducked low, coughing, dragging the launcher back into the basement as enemy rifles cracked outside. The bazooka had spoken, and another armored giant had fallen. Only months earlier, scenes like this would have been unimaginable. American infantry had known the taste of helplessness when tanks approached. Men remembered huddling in foxholes as the ground shook, hearing the grinding roar of treads and the metallic shriek of turrets turning. They recalled clutching rifles that felt like sticks against giants. Grenades bounced harmlessly from armor, bullets sparked and died against steel. To face a Panzer without support was to wait for death or capture. Soldiers whispered bitterly that their lives were worth nothing when tanks rolled. But now, with the bazooka slung across their shoulders, the balance had shifted. The same men who once trembled in foxholes now crouched behind walls with a strange mix of fear and grim anticipation. They whispered to each other, "We've got a fighting chance." 2 men, 1 tube, and a handful of rockets could do what once required artillery batteries. The feeling spread like fire. Tanks were no longer gods of the battlefield. They could bleed. They could burn. In the vineyards of southern Italy, squads took to hiding in rows of grapevines, pressing the tubes against their shoulders as they lay in wait. In the broken ruins of Cassino, bazooka teams crawled through rubble, firing from doorways and shattered stairwells. At Anzio, where every advance was a desperate gamble, the bazooka became the weapon of ambush. Gunners popped up from ditches, loosed their rockets, and vanished again into smoke. Tank crews cursed and sweated inside their steel coffins, pounding hatches shut, knowing that every corner might conceal the weapon they had once mocked. The details became part of the rhythm of battle. Rockets carried in heavy canvas bags clattered against helmets as loaders scrambled across streets. The crackle of the electric contact switch sent shivers through gunners, the moment before ignition taut with danger. Then came the blast, a searing backwash that filled alleys with choking smoke, revealing the shooter's position as surely as a flare. Black trails marked the rocket's flight, etched against walls and ruins until it slammed into steel. Crews worked in pairs, one firing, the other hauling fresh rounds, both knowing they had seconds before machine guns or mortars sought them out. For German crews, it was a nightmare. Sweat poured down their faces as they hunched inside armored hulls, heat suffocating, air thick with the smell of oil and exhaust. They had been told infantry could do nothing to them. Now, every rattle of stone, every shadow at a window, every flicker of movement carried the threat of death. Commanders barked at infantry escorts to sweep streets ahead, ordering riflemen to clear windows, to probe ruins, to flush out the 2-man teams with their cursed rocket pipes. The arrogance of earlier months was gone. Panzers no longer advanced alone, and yet, even with escorts, the danger remained. The streets of Italy belonged not just to tanks, but to men with courage and stovepipes. Every new battle reinforced the truth. Reports circulated, bazooka squads halting entire columns, crippling tanks in ambush after ambush. Wehrmacht intelligence admitted the unthinkable. In Berlin, notes were written with a new tone of respect, bordering on alarm. The American bazooka is effective against armor at close range. It must be considered a danger to Panzer crews. The German answer came quickly. Engineers studied captured examples, pried open the rockets, and tested the launchers. From this came the Panzer, the tank fright. It was longer, heavier, capable of greater penetration, and a direct imitation of the weapon they had laughed at. The name itself was an admission, a quiet acknowledgement of fear. The Germans had taken the toy they mocked and transformed it into their own instrument of war. Still, in the Italian campaign, it was the Americans who wielded the original with deadly effect. In the ruins of Cassino, bazooka fire echoed off the stones, mingling with the rattle of rifles and the boom of artillery. In Naples, narrow streets became traps where tanks burned, casting orange light against ancient walls. At Anzio, where survival often depended on ambush, the sight of a bazooka resting on a soldier's shoulder brought confidence to his comrades and dread to his enemy. The weapon was imperfect. Its range was short, its accuracy fickle, its smoke a dangerous beacon. But in the hands of determined men, it was enough. Enough to level the scales between flesh and steel. Enough to prove that what had been called a toy was in truth a revolution. And with every flaming wreck left behind in Italy's alleys and fields, that revolution carved itself deeper into the story of the war. By 1944, the stovepipe was no longer a curiosity. It had become a constant companion of the American infantryman, as common as a rifle or a helmet. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where tanks crept cautiously through fields hemmed in by thick green walls, bazooka teams lurked in ambush. In French villages, they fired from attics and barns, sending rockets into Panzer IVs that prowled the cobblestones. And in the Ardennes, when the Battle of the Bulge erupted with the roar of German armor breaking through snowy forests, bazookas were there too, clutched in freezing hands, rockets carried in canvas bags stiff with frost. By then, every squad had men assigned to carry and fire the weapon. What had begun as an experiment was now standard practice. One gunner, one loader, each pair charged with defending their brothers against steel monsters. Reports counted the wrecks left behind, hundreds of German tanks and assault guns crippled or destroyed by bazooka fire. For the men who faced them, the numbers told only part of the story. The real victory was in confidence. Where once a tank sent whole platoons scattering, now a squad stood its ground, waiting for the chance to strike back. And the irony was impossible to ignore. The weapon that German officers had dismissed with laughter, that they had labeled a toy, became a terror whispered about in foxholes and tank cabins alike. Prisoners taken in France admitted it freely. We feared the little tube more than the Sherman. One Panzer crewman told his interrogators that he hated advancing into villages not because of artillery or aircraft, but because every doorway might hide the pipe. For American soldiers, the memory of that shift was unforgettable. Veterans recalled the first time they saw a tank destroyed by a single rocket. "You could fight back," one GI said. "For the first time you weren't helpless, you weren't just waiting to die." The bazooka gave the ordinary rifleman a weapon of defiance, something that turned fear into resolve. By the end of the war, its influence stretched far beyond Italy or France. Captured examples had inspired the German Panzer. Soviet engineers studied them closely, producing their own versions that would evolve into the RPG, a weapon that would dominate conflicts for decades. The design, simple, brutal, effective, became the template for modern anti-tank warfare. From Korea to Vietnam and beyond, echoes of the bazooka appeared on battlefields, a legacy born from a tube once mocked as nothing more than plumbing pipe. Even its name lived on. The odd joke borrowed from a radio comedian's brass contraption outlived the comedian himself. Bazooka became shorthand for raw, destructive punch, a word that outgrew the battlefield and entered everyday language. When something hit hard, when something carried overwhelming force, people called it a bazooka. And yet, in the quiet moments after victory, the weapon remained a symbol of something simpler. It was never perfect. It smoked, it misfired, it revealed the shooter's position in a flash of fire. But it was there when men needed it most. It was the difference between panic and courage, between helpless retreat and defiance. It was proof that even the simplest tool in determined hands could change the course of a battle. The war ended in 1945, leaving ruins and silence across Europe. In one such town, sunlight broke through shattered windows and cast long beams across the rubble. Among the bricks and twisted iron lay a bazooka, battered from use but still functional, leaning against a wall as if waiting for another fight. Its paint was scorched, its tube scratched, its edges roughened by countless hands. But in its scars lay a story, the story of a weapon born from mockery, carried in desperation and remembered in triumph. And so the tale closed with words meant for all who had once laughed. They called it a toy. But for men who once faced steel monsters barehanded, it was salvation, a stovepipe that changed the battlefield.